Hello everyone, we're just going to wait a couple of minutes and let everyone filter in. We're really glad that you're here today. If you'd like to say hello to us in the chat, and also, I don't know about you, but this is the first time we've had sun in ages here. In the past week, we've had fog and hail and rain. So really glad that we finally got some sunshine. Feels like we've experienced every single season. So if you'd like to say hello in the chat, and if anyone wants to tell us what their favourite season is, to give us some insight into you guys who've joined the call, we'd love to know. Hello to everyone else who's just joined. We're just waiting for everyone to filter in. Michael, what would you say that your favourite season is?
It's got to be summer, hasn't it? No excuse for a beer garden, but yeah, summer for me.
Yeah, if that ever happens in Britain, hopefully it will. Got someone in the chat saying spring, it's also a good shout. Maybe it's just around the corner. Paul, are you taking a vote?
You know what? I've got to go summer as well. Recently invested in an Apple Watch, so a lot of my time spent trying to get my step count up. So obviously the longer summer days greatly assist with that. So definitely summer for me.
Yeah, much more bearable if it's not raining for sure. Okay, perfect. I think we've now got quite a few people who've joined, and we're going to make a start. So from talking about seasons, we're going to do a smooth segue into the umbrella consultation. So today's webinar will cover the potential impact of the consultation on the umbrella and recruitment market. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Giant Group, a leading contingent workforce management company for over 30 years. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm Betty Underwood and I'm the Events Marketing Coordinator here at Giant Group. I'll be your host today as we learn more about the umbrella consultation. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll focus on the potential impact of the umbrella consultation, exploring what proposals the government has made and sharing our views on the likely outcomes and how businesses should prepare for the changes. We expect there to be lots of questions, so please send them via the Q&A button and we'll leave 20 minutes or so at the end to address as many as possible. The areas we'll cover include the background and why HMRC are in consultation, an overview of the consultation and the proposed options, tax and maintenance day update from the 18th of April, what the potential risks are for hiring companies, how the market might react to the changes, potential solutions, and then we'll get to your questions. Our keynote speakers today are firstly Michael Howard, Head of Agency Sales here at Giant Group. Michael has worked in the industry for 14 years, helping agencies navigate through a variety of legislation changes to ensure compliance and maintain profitability. Michael heads up our agency sales team to ensure our recruitment partners have access to the full range of Giant Group services. Today, we are also joined by Paul Richmond, who is a key account director in our agency sales team here at Giant. His role includes the management of a number of Giant's key accounts throughout the UK. The format of the session will be for Michael and Paul to address several set questions, which I'll put to them in order to give us a full view from a high-risk perspective. Please don't hesitate to submit your questions throughout. So without further ado, let's begin with a look at the current state of the market and why the government has held this consultation. Paul, good afternoon. We'll come to you first. Can you explain what the problem that HMRC are looking to address with this consultation is?
Thanks, Betty, and hi everyone, and thanks for joining. With the consultation, HMRC are seeking views on proposals to tackle non-compliance with both tax and employment rights by umbrella companies in the UK. At the moment, there are around 600 umbrella companies in the UK, each with varying degrees of compliance. The market itself remains non-regulated and it appears government has been slow to react. And one of the main reasons for this is the difficulty of defining what an umbrella company is. And because of this, it has asked for suggestions from the market. The government has three main objectives with the consultation. The first of these is to deliver improved outcomes for workers. This might be in relation to employment rights, tax, holiday pay. Ultimately, they want to make sure the correct tax is being paid on behalf of the workers. They also want to support a level playing field in the umbrella company market and ensure there is fair competition throughout. Finally, and I guess ultimately financially, they want to protect taxpayers from significant revenue losses that currently arise from non-compliance. As many of the listeners here today will know, there are still a number of sectors where compliance is far from being the highest priority, and these are the sectors specifically which can cause huge losses for HMRC. Now, to tackle non-compliance in the contingent labour market, HMRC are proposing 3 options. Now, we will cover off each of these options in more detail later in the webinar, but to summarise now, option 1 would be the introduction of mandatory due diligence, with penalties applying to those employment businesses or end clients that do not comply. Option 2 would be to introduce new legislation to give HMRC the power to collect an umbrella company tax debt from another business in the supply chain. And finally, option 3 is to deem the employment business that supplies the worker to the end client to be the employee for tax purposes. This could potentially remove the requirement for an umbrella company altogether and would require a party further up the supply chain to operate pay-as-you-earn on payments to contingent workers. The final part of the consultation wanted views specifically on how to reduce fraud relating to the employment allowance and VAT flat rate scheme, as both are currently targeted by fraudulent umbrella companies. It also sets out a proposal to mandate a UK director to be in place for a company to be eligible for the employment allowance.
Thanks so much, Paul. Michael, if I can bring you in at this point, can you tell us how big of an issue non-compliance is in the umbrella market currently? Michael, I think you're on mute.
Technology, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Betty. Good afternoon, everyone. So I suppose to address the non-compliance within the umbrella marketplace, unfortunately, since I've been in the industry and for many of those on the webinar today, it has been tarnished with non-compliance for a number of years, and hence why HMRC have drafted consultation around this topic. Non-compliance can be and has been deemed in a number of ways over the number of years. Historically, contingent workers have been paid in the form of Isle of Man offshore solutions. These loan schemes historically have been paid. Workers receive 90% take home, loan payments not to be repaid, and ultimately PAYE tax and national insurance is never being paid in the correct way. Contingent workers also historically have been paid in the way of being paid in the form of an MSCP, managed service company provider, where again maybe payments in the form of dividends have been declared rather than relevant PAYE tax and national insurance. Other recent examples of non-compliance, and again touched on recently just by my colleague Paul, are sort of mini umbrella companies. This is rife in certain sectors, and this is a formulation of a number of smaller companies within a large group that don't meet the thresholds of national insurance and/or VAT. And this is not in the spirit or of what the legislation of what an umbrella company should be. I think non-compliance does vary across sectors. So for those people on the call today, varying sectors you'll be supplying contingent workers in. For those that have high level of contingent workers, potentially maybe in educational or medical sectors, it's very much a case of the contractor dictates how they're to be paid rather than a guided approach and a more compliant-led approach, maybe more so that's occurred in the white-collar sector market, sort of where there's generally agency or client preferred supplier lists that are being flowed down that supply chain.
Thanks,
HMRC,
Michael. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Carry on.
Sorry. HMRC, they have made steps in previous legislative changes to try and target this non-compliance activity that's apparent in the marketplace. Back in 2007, they brought in the MSC legislation to try and stop different types of contractors being paid in the form of dividends. If they did, they had to run their own limited company rather than it being managed for them. I think if you fast forward a couple of years later, 2014, HMRC brought in the onshore offshore legislation, which again prompted the increase in recruitment agencies, MSPs, client preferred supplier lists to ensure that the right level of compliance is flowed down throughout the supply chain. Furthermore, over the next few years, HMRC then targeted specifically umbrella contractors who were benefited from travel and subsistence tax relief when they were travelling to and from their home place of work. This is still allowed to this day, but there is a big caveat where contractors who can only claim this benefit if they're not under supervision, direction and control, clearly meaning the majority of contractors are not able to claim the benefit they previously were eligible to. And I think finally, Betty, the sort of non-compliance within the sector has been challenged by HMRC with the Criminal Finance Act being brought in a couple of years back. This again affects all suppliers, MSPs, clients, agencies, even umbrella companies, to ensure that they're taking reasonable care to ensure that there is non-compliance throughout that supply chain.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michael. A quick reminder at this point, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we'll get round to your questions at the end. And then, Paul, could you please explain how the consultation process works and what are the timeframes that are involved?
Yeah, sure. So as mentioned earlier, HMRC has outlined 3 areas where they have suggested changes could be made. We still don't have any tangible information on exactly what umbrella market regulation will look like following last week's announcement from the government, but we expect this to be included in their planned guidance further into 2024. What we can say now is that we believe they are looking at option 1 of 3, which is the mandating of due diligence. We welcome this update as a vital step in moving towards regulation in the marketplace. This is not to be taken as just a supervisory update. It's seen as a next step towards a wide-ranging overhaul of the sector. Many contractors, agencies and hirers view this overhaul as vital to restoring trust in the contingent labour market. This ensures the sector is compliant with regulations and that there are adequate deterrents to stop bad actors from exploiting the supply chain further. The update last week also included a reference to an online pay checking tool to help umbrella company workers to check the correct deductions are being made from their pay. Now, some people will know about the issues related to the reliability of the previously introduced CES tool, so it remains to be seen how useful or accurate this pay checking tool will be once it's actually launched. Like everyone else, we're just waiting further updates later this year, and we'll look to provide more information and guidance as and when it becomes available. Just before we do move on, I do also want to highlight another update that HMRC provided on Monday. It was titled, and I'll quote, "A warning for employment agencies using umbrella companies," and I thought this might be relevant. As it stated, it is aware of uncompliant umbrella companies who use recruitment agencies to promote their tax avoidance schemes. Now, typically, these umbrella companies give commitments about their schemes to agencies that are too good to be true, and we know they often are. Now, whilst employment and recruitment agencies might believe they're agreeing to one set of arrangements, it could be a tax avoidance scheme that the umbrella is promoting. These schemes are targeted at contingent workers who may not know the risks of using the schemes, and HMRC have advised that employment and recruitment agencies should first of all be checking the details they're given by umbrella companies about their products, but also consider taking independent professional advice if they're unsure if an umbrella company they plan to use is compliant. Ultimately, most of these schemes do not work and are usually successfully challenged by HMRC in the courts and tribunals, and agencies need to avoid recommending such schemes. HMRC have also explicitly stated agencies must also carry out due diligence to make sure they are not using non-compliant umbrella companies. Now, HMRC have come up with a checklist to identify if an umbrella company may be operating a tax avoidance scheme, and do just want to highlight just a few of those points now because I think they are quite useful. So umbrella companies who offer financial incentives which are significantly higher than industry standards. Now, from my experience, this is usually the most obvious red flag, as these incentives are often used to entice workers to push their candidates in a certain direction. If the umbrella company is potentially providing contractors and the agency with different versions of their pay slips, or if the umbrella company makes payments to workers that are higher than the amount on their pay slips. Again, it may seem quite obvious, but unless the right questions are being asked, it can often go unnoticed. And the final 2 points, points 4 and 5, are often linked. So it's if the umbrella company is making payments to third parties who then make payments to the workers, or if the umbrella company is based outside of the UK. Both are usually used to disguise the umbrella company's true operation. HMRC did stress that the points raised there are not exhaustive, and there may be other things to look out for with these umbrella companies. If we look forward towards the risks, obviously the first, but obviously being reputational. I mean, as an agency or end hirer, you are at risk if you take part in non-compliant umbrella supply chains. These include supply chains involving umbrella companies which are operating tax avoidance schemes. And taking part in these supply chains could potentially damage the reputation of your business, affect your ability to secure and maintain contracts, or affect your business relationships with workers and end clients. And of course, I guess most importantly, another key risk is the financial risk. You could also face financial damage due to penalties and tax liabilities. HMRC have explicitly stated that they will pursue those who promote or enable tax avoidance. And if HMRC defeats an abusive tax avoidance arrangement, they will use the enabler's penalty regime against anyone who designed the arrangement, sold the arrangement, or who enabled the use of the arrangement. So it's pretty comprehensive. And under new powers introduced in 2022, HMRC can publish information about enablers when they suspect they're involved in either promoting a tax avoidance scheme or having a role in making a scheme available to use. The government recently, as we know, consulted on the options to tackle non-compliance in the umbrella company market, and these included penalties for agencies failing to carry out mandatory due diligence, or additional circumstances in which agencies could be liable to pay tax liabilities. Responses to the consultation will be published in due course, and HMRC announced this will happen further into 2024. The current guidance from HMRC on steps to take to help protect your business include finding out how to reduce your risk of using an umbrella company who operates tax avoidance schemes, regularly checking HMRC's list of named tax avoidance schemes, promoters, enablers, and suppliers, and finally being aware of the responsibilities for employment businesses working with umbrella companies. I guess finally, HMRC do have a "Don't Get Caught Out," I quote, campaign, which is used to help workers spot the warning signs of tax avoidance and, of course, report any tax avoidance which is going on as well.
Thanks so much, Paul. Michael, could you please give us an overview of the potential risks that exist for hirers?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Betty. I suppose as a supplier in any contingent supply chain, risk has got to be at the forefront of everybody's mind. We saw back in 2017 with I-35 and 2021 that there was a lot of client input. There was a lot of potential knee-jerk around risk, and that has impacted on the number of limited companies that are being allowed to be engaged, rightfully or not. So I think the biggest risk for anybody and any clients on this webinar is to make sure that decisions are made based on what compliance risks that they're going to inherit. I think what we may see is a reduction in the number of different umbrella companies that are used by hirers or by recruitment agencies. That doesn't necessarily mean that umbrellas will be removed from the supply chain. What we believe will happen, based on all of the information that we've gathered over the last 12, 18 months and previous years as to what HMRC are looking for, is to make sure that those umbrella companies that are providing payroll services in the supply chain are doing them correctly and doing it compliantly, more importantly. I think, like Paul's mentioned on some of the points earlier, some of these non-compliant businesses do provide out of the ordinary benefits and commercial benefits to the supply chain, some being the benefit of leveraging payment terms. So what we may well see is some sort of domino effect, is that if a non-compliant business is taken out of that supply chain, the likelihood is that if they do replace then with a compliant provider, the same level of commercial opportunities may not be there. So it may well have a strain on the supply chain. We understand that there is cash flow challenges all the way from end hirer potentially down to MSP, recruitment agency, because of the amount of timesheets that need to be approved and the delay and agreements that are in place. So I think we've just got to be mindful that if there are non-compliant businesses in that supply chain, it isn't just a case of being able to swap the current commercial arrangements with a compliant business, because clearly the non-compliant business may well be able to move funds to be able to cover that commercial arrangement. I think what we'll see is preferred supplier list consolidation. And I think businesses that are on this webinar, whether you're legal, whether you're a business owner, whether you're compliant, I think looking at what HMRC are trying to achieve here is get the umbrella market compliant, remove that non-compliance that have been there for a number of years. I think we will see a PSL consolidation for those businesses that are able to provide financial stability throughout the supply chain. I think it's important that businesses not only look at what accreditations businesses have got and how long they've been in the market for, but also have a look deeper into the financial stability of that company. Ultimately, cash is passed through a number of entities from end hirer all the way through to the contractor. So to ensure that you have financial partners, financial secure partners in that supply chain is important. I go back to the increased level of risk for non-compliant providers. This isn't just an exercise that HMRC are trying to sort of put a tick in the box for. They are highlighting that there is a huge spotlight on non-compliance within this sector. You look at the financial sector, you have the FCA to make sure it's regulated. We don't have that regulation. So I think there's a huge spotlight on the loss of money that the Treasury are losing due to non-compliance. So the risks are only going to get bigger. The risks have previously in other legislation changes moved up the supply chain. So it's not just the umbrella company or the umbrella company director. It could well be the recruitment agency, the MSP, or the end client, and debt transfer is also apparent in other legislation. So it doesn't surprise me that HMRC have gone down this route. And as Paul mentioned on his parts, we here at Giant would welcome regulation. We here at Giant would welcome compliance across the board, and ultimately that puts everybody on a level playing field. So for me, the risks are going to be greater for those that don't follow the rules. But I think for us that, do embrace the change and do embrace the compliance angles that HMRC are looking to achieve, there will be a greater outlook for us all moving forward.
Amazing. Thanks, Michael. Paul, from your recent conversations with hirers, how do you think they might react to the proposed changes that have been highlighted last week?
This is a good question, and as set out in the call for evidence, HMRC is aware of several types of tax non-compliance that are prevalent in the umbrella company market. These usually include fraud and disguised tax avoidance arrangements. HMRC has already been taking some action in attempting to police the market and make progress in tackling non-compliance. Currently, they have a web page which details what is essentially a blacklist. It's a large number of umbrella companies who they have identified as being non-compliant. Unfortunately, this has little effect on the wider market and is seen as being more reactive rather than preventative at this time. The government as a whole is looking to deliver a more strategic approach to address all non-compliant behaviour that is facilitated by umbrella companies. Again, responses to the call for evidence suggested that the current operations of the temporary labour market encourages end clients and employment businesses to outsource many of their obligations to umbrella companies. Now, whilst outsourcing is a legitimate business model and can create administrative and cost efficiencies for businesses, it can also create risks. Now, these risks are significant, especially in the umbrella company market, where in some cases, companies can be responsible for processing millions of pounds of payments for workers and ensuring the correct tax and national insurance contributions are passed on to HMRC. And of course, the risk can also lead to harm for workers who may not receive the correct national insurance credits, with potential consequences for their state pension entitlements. These which umbrella companies can be established and subsequently liquidated poses significant challenges for HMRC to take effective enforcement action where non-compliance is identified. And responses to the call for evidence also suggested that those businesses that do take steps to ensure good compliances are good compliance and are put at a competitive disadvantage to those who are not. So essentially, it means that those who are non-compliant often have a competitive advantage to those who aren't. And ultimately, that's not fair on legitimate businesses, and in turn puts pressure on those that are compliant to cut corners to compete, driving down standards across the entire market. Now, as mentioned earlier, from their update last week, we believe HMRC is looking towards option one, which is mandating due diligence. Not only is this now the most likely option, but it is also potentially the least disruptive of the three options available. The government has stated that they'll, and I'll quote this, a statutory due diligence regime for businesses that use umbrella companies. So currently recruitment agencies and hirers, they have their own due diligence processes when either they're bringing on a new umbrella partner to their PSL, or potentially if they're doing PSL renewals. Now, the government's view, is that employment businesses who supply workers to end clients undertake some form of due diligence on the umbrella companies they contract with to ensure that those companies are, first of all, genuine, that they comply with their obligations, and that they treat their workers properly. However, this is not universal across the market, as some businesses are having no or only sometimes limited procedures in place. Typically, the compliance questionnaires which are currently used are based on either APSCO or REC frameworks. They tend to only look at the surface level of compliance of umbrella companies. The larger or enterprise level employment businesses tend to have additional compliance protocols they require the onward supply chain to be subjected to during the PSL vetting process. Respondents also suggested that entities further up the supply chain, such as end clients, often do not have a full view of the entities that make up their labour supply chain, which of course is a massive risk. The government believes this lack of visibility and absence of due diligence may create the gaps non-compliant umbrella companies need to enter and operate within this labour supply chain. That being said, and I guess looking forward, in the last documented update, which was June 2023, it was stated the government is interested in exploring a requirement for organisations contracting with umbrella companies to carry out a minimum level of due diligence on that umbrella company. The government is interested in exploring if a requirement for businesses using umbrella companies to carry out a mandatory due diligence with the potential penalty for failing to do so may lead to fewer non-compliant umbrella companies entering labour supply chains, protecting workers from the harms that can potentially arise. Now, how it might be delivered, the preferred option could be delivered through a statutory requirement to undertake due diligence. Now, the obligation would sit with either the end client or an employment business that is in their contractual relationship with and supplies the worker to the end client. It is the government's view that a mandatory due diligence requirement should require businesses to seek to secure their labour supply chains against all forms of tax non-compliance, and this can include the error or avoidance, or in some cases fraud. Now, the government previously considered requiring businesses to conduct due diligence into whether individuals working via their own personal service companies were complying with IR35, ultimately rejecting the idea in favour of an extension of off-payroll working reform in April 2021. The proposal in this consultation is for a broader due diligence requirement covering the conduct of a type of employment intermediary which operates in a substantially different way, supplying many workers at once rather than a single worker typically supplied by a personal service company. We believe the government recognises the need for businesses to have certainty around due diligence requirements, yet we still await exactly what these requirements will entail. And given the range of checks that can fall within the definition of due diligence and that different checks may be more or less relevant in certain scenarios, the government considers that it may be preferable that any legislative requirement is not prescriptive as to the precise checks which should be undertaken, that the government is still reviewing this particular point. Instead, HMRC could look to support businesses to understand what is expected of them and how to comply with the requirements through guidance. For example, HMRC has already published guidance on due diligence principles when sourcing labour, which sets out the steps customers can take to ensure the integrity of the labour supply chains.
Thanks so much, Paul. And going on from that, what do you think the potential impact would be if the mandating of due diligence was introduced? Could there be potential penalties involved?
Well, I guess if you look at the potential penalties first, the new due diligence requirement could be supported by a penalty regime, and businesses in the scope of the requirement would be subject to a penalty if they fail to undertake the required due diligence. Now, the penalties could either be a set fixed amount, or it could potentially be linked to the amount of any tax that has not been paid by a non-compliant umbrella company in the business's labour supply chain. The government is still reviewing the views from stakeholders on the scale of the penalty for failure to comply with the requirement that would achieve the desired change in business. Ultimately, there needs to be a suitable fine in place for it to actually have an impact in the supply chain. But the intention of the penalty regime would be, as I say, to incentivise the end clients ultimately and the agencies to ensure the legitimacy of any umbrella companies they choose to utilise. So again, it's just focusing on that accountability in the supply chain. The government also currently recognises that in some instances, despite the best efforts of end clients and employment businesses, tax non-compliance may still occur within the labour supply chain. As well as views on the appropriate level of penalty to deliver on the intention of the requirement, the government would be interested to hear about what safeguards stakeholders think should be part of any mandatory due diligence regime. And obviously you mentioned about potential impacts. Again, the government are interested to understand what the respondents think would be the impacts of any mandatory due diligence requirement being introduced. And they're also interested in the respondents' views on the impacts that the mandatory due diligence requirement could have for workers engaged by umbrella companies as well. The government have set out a few key areas that they have stated have consistently been reported to them as being main areas of detriment for umbrella companies. They stated it would be possible to add to these regulations if, after sufficient review, it was considered necessary. We feel these are now areas of focus which will be further outlined in the update later this year. In terms of identifying those key areas, I'll just quickly touch on them very, very quickly now. So the first of those is the handling of pay and holiday pay. So the government could potentially require umbrella companies to pay the individuals they employ all the money they owed for the hours they've worked. Now, this obligation should apply, however, the umbrella company structures its contracts and should require the umbrella company to pay the individual even though they have not been paid by the employment business. The second key area is around the use of additional services. The government could seek to prevent umbrella companies making entry into an employment contract conditional upon the individual agreeing to pay for the additional services offered by the umbrella company beyond their margin. The government could also require greater transparency about their margin up front. And finally, the point around key information documents. The government could place a positive duty on umbrella companies to pass on accurate information employment businesses need to provide on a key information document. It would remain the responsibility ultimately of the employment business, though, to issue the KID. That covers essentially as much as we know around option one and around the mandating of due diligence. Very, very quickly before we do move on, I just want to touch on the other two options and what their potential impacts could be if they were taken forward. So if we circle back and remember, option two was the potential transfer of debt up the supply chain. Obviously, this would be a lot more disruptive, especially if you look at how Highways reacted to IR35 when it was introduced. The idea behind option two is the government's expectation that increasing the accountability will also increase the compliance. And this would have a considerable impact on all members of the supply chain. And then finally, if you look at option three, which is essentially deeming the employment business that supplies the worker to the end client to be the employee for tax purposes, this would lead to a big increase in a demand for agencies to provide pay as you earn themselves. However, umbrella companies could still have a role to play. And here at Giant, we do offer a PEO service, which I believe we will touch on shortly.
Thanks so much for that, Paul. That's a really nice segue into the final question concerning the potential solutions that are available. Michael, could you please run through the options?
Yeah, thanks, Betty. I suppose with us not getting too much detail last week, and we're still await for the finer detail later on this year, solutions are always open to interpretation. I think one of the options that a lot of the supply chains will head towards is having a reduced preferred supplier list. So we see a lot of supply chains where PSLs are suggested, PSLs are recommended, PSLs are advised, but the actual percentage of what the PSL is used is maybe 70–80%. There's a lot of exceptions. There's a lot of people demanding to go through different engagement models and different engagement partners. And I think while the risk is still there now, I think the increase in spotlight will just enhance that level of compliance from end hirer all the way through to worker. I think it's important, if you're on the webinar today and you look at your supply chain, how many times do you go outside of the list? How many times do you engage with people who are not on that, whether it's agency preferred supplier list or umbrella for preferred supplier list? I think you'd be very, very good if there's 100% preferred supplier list engagement. But I think from speaking to a lot of clients over the last couple of years, there is exceptions, and I think them exceptions will be reduced given the spotlight on compliance. I think, as Paul mentioned, PAYE is not something that businesses want to offer, whether you're an end client, whether you're an MSP or a recruitment agency. The reason you don't offer that is because you're not in the payroll sector, you're an end client, an end hirer, an MSP, or you're in search and selection. Giant are in a fortunate position, touching on what Paul mentioned, is that we've provided outsourced payroll for 10, 15 years. So should the need for a greater level of PAYE service be required, we're in a great position where not only can we provide an outsourced payroll service, which is an option, but we can also provide a fully managed PEO service, which allows the benefit for contractors and contingent workers to still retain the benefit of contributing towards a self-invested private pension. One of the main benefits of what the umbrella company offers at the moment, which helps retain and attract talent. So for me, Giant do provide that benefit if we did need to pivot in that direction. I think touching on, the HMRC's view of whether they want to go down the route of, tax purposes, employment purposes, we do have the flexibility if it did need to go down the PAYE route to offer a contract for service or a contract of employment. And again, we can be very, very flexible with the demands of the market. For those clients on board on the webinar at the moment, I touched on this point earlier. Cash flow seems to be a very, very relevant topic at the moment when I'm having meetings. When you ask for suppliers, whether that's agencies, whether that's MSPs, or whether that's directly with umbrella companies to provide an angle here of payment terms, it's fantastic that the number of businesses can step up and be able to offer this in a way that's similar to what Giant can. But I think just in terms of added due diligence and added questions for your compliance checklist, do you ask that insurance, that level of payment terms is insured? It's great that they can tick a box and businesses can tick boxes on RFIs to say that they can provide payment terms. But you take that layer a little bit further forward and ask the question, great that you're able to provide us with payment terms, but is this insured? And the reason I put that point on there is that there's an increased number of challenges for businesses when it comes to cash flow, when it comes to payment terms being put on them to be in a supply chain. But you actually look further down the supply chain from client to MSP to umbrella company to agency, whether any of that debt is insured. And again, this comes down to compliance and comes down to that contingent supply chain of where we want to get our marketplace to be. We want the marketplace to be compliant. We want partners in that supply chain to do the right thing, and ultimately make sure that we move away from that tarnished supply chain that we've been on, unfortunately, for a number of years now. And I think HMRC have made great steps moving in that direction. There is still a long way to go, and I think the update we got on Monday regarding Spotlight 64, the update we got last Thursday on Tax and Administration Day shows that HMRC are taking this seriously. We have to see what the further update is in the summer, but ultimately, for all of those businesses, owners and compliance on the webinar today, it's very, very important that we don't just have an annual RFI check and an annual paper sift option. We look at auditing payslips, we look at regular quarterly reviews on how these workers are paid from the flow of funds from the client all the way down to the workers that are receiving the funds. And we're happy to that the HMRC are on this journey. But we just want to be able to ensure that the supply chain can be as compliant as possible.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you both for some real insight over the last half hour or so into something that moving forward we'll all need to embrace and have a really good understanding of. We've received a couple of questions, so let's see if we can answer those now. So Adam asked, to what extent can an agency take reassurance from only using accredited umbrella companies? For example, a professional passport or FCSA accreditation. Would this completely eliminate risk of that non-compliance, or is the risk still there? And maybe can you give us some tips?
Yeah, thanks, Betty. Thanks for the question, Adam. I think there are a number of gold standard industry compliance bodies. You mentioned a few on your question: professional passport, FCSA. And while they have a lot of good practices and they provide a lot of great advice on what to look out for, the question, does it completely eliminate risk or non-compliance? I think we've got to be honest and say no, it doesn't. We're not a regulated market, so we would welcome that. But what I would say is, yes, it's important to listen to businesses you've mentioned on your question and regarding, you know, things to be aware of, things to look out for. I think you've got to, as a business owner, and maybe people in legal or people in compliance, have got to take their own responsibilities on what input they would like. And I think we've covered quite a few points here today, is that just because an RFI is answered with a tick of a box, do we go further detail on levels of insurance, on, you know, what instances they would do in terms of a certain situation? So without trying to skirt around the answer, no, it doesn't eliminate all of the or any non-compliance. What it does is it gives you confidence that then businesses are aligned to a business that provides best advice. But ultimately, it's down to you as a supplier to be able to ensure that what they do and how they carry out their working practices meet the demands of HMRC's compliance.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michael. And what outcome do we think HMRC will choose, and what could the potential time frame be on that?
Well, I guess it's kind of been covered out. I didn't say this one, Michael. In terms of the potential outcome, obviously at the moment we don't know either way. Where at the moment we're kind of going month by month for updates to understand exactly which way the government are going to go. I've mentioned in my piece that we believe it's more than going to be option one, and we've come to that conclusion based on the wording of their most recent update, which was last week. And obviously that's the way that we think they're going to go, and ultimately it's the way which we believe will have probably the least impact for us as Giant, and in terms of the wider supply market as well. But ultimately we don't know, and until we get that kind of concrete confirmation from HMRC to say this is the route they're definitely taking, we'll have to kind of wait and see until that moment comes around.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap it up there. But thank you so much, Michael and Paul, for being on the call today. We'll follow up tomorrow with an email with this recording and also with a questionnaire. We'd love you to let us know what you thought. And if you've got any specific questions, then Michael and Paul can answer your questions post-webinar. We are really pleased to be able to have the expertise at Giant to be able to answer any of your questions. So thanks again for joining us today. And please get in touch if you'd like any further information. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Cheers.
Betty. Cheers.